What happens when you decide that a university library shouldn't feel like a building at all, but rather like walking across an undulating landscape where knowledge, social interaction, and individual study flow together without walls, without corridors, without any of the spatial hierarchies we've come to expect from institutional architecture? The Rolex Learning Center in Lausanne, Switzerland, designed by the Tokyo-based firm SANAA and completed in 2010, is perhaps one of the most radical experiments in architectural continuity of the 21st century, and whether you see it as a brilliant redefinition of public learning space or as an overly ambitious spatial experiment that sacrifices practicality for conceptual purity, there's no denying that this building forces us to reconsider what we mean when we talk about program, structure, and the very ground we walk on. Kazuyo Sejima and Ryu Nishizawa, the principals of SANAA, had already established themselves as masters of lightness, transparency, and spatial ambiguity by the time they won this commission, with projects like the Glass Pavilion at the Toledo Museum of Art and the New Museum in New York demonstrating their commitment to dissolving the traditional boundaries between inside and outside, between one function and another, between the building and its surroundings. But the Rolex Learning Center took these ideas to an almost unprecedented scale and complexity. The brief called for a learning center that would serve the École Polytechnique Fédérale de Lausanne, one of Europe's leading technical universities, and the program was ambitious. A library with 500,000 books, study spaces for 800 students, a language learning center, multimedia facilities, offices, restaurants, cafes, and various social spaces, all of which would normally be organized into separate floors, separate wings, separate zones with clear functional divisions. But SANAA proposed something entirely different. Instead of stacking functions vertically or organizing them into discrete rooms and corridors, they imagined a single continuous surface, a gently undulating slab that would cover 20,000 square meters, creating valleys and hills, voids and plateaus, all within one fluid horizontal plane where the floor becomes the ceiling, becomes the structure, becomes the architecture itself. This idea of the continuous surface is central to understanding the Rolex Learning Center, because it's not just a formal gesture or an aesthetic choice, it's a fundamental rethinking of how architectural space can be organized and experienced, and it stems directly from SANAA's broader design philosophy, which consistently privileges horizontality, transparency, and the elimination of hierarchy. If you study their body of work, you'll notice that SANAA almost always seeks to dissolve the conventional markers of architectural authority. They avoid monumental gestures, they minimize material expression, they create spaces that feel open and democratic rather than imposing and didactic, and in the Rolex Learning Center, this approach manifests as a refusal to separate or categorize, a refusal to say this space is for reading, and that space is for socializing, and this corridor takes you from one to the other, because instead the entire building becomes a topography of possibilities where students can move freely, finding pockets of concentration in the dips and valleys, encountering others on the plateaus and slopes, discovering unexpected views and connections as they navigate this artificial landscape. The structural concept that makes this possible is as audacious as the spatial idea itself, because what SANAA proposed and what the Swiss engineering firm Bollinger und Grauman helped realize is essentially a single perforated concrete slab, roughly 166 meters long and 122 meters wide, that curves and undulates in both directions, creating a doubly curved surface that required extraordinary precision in both design and construction. The slab varies in thickness from about half a meter in some areas to nearly 1.5 meters in others, and it's punctured by 14 oval voids of varying sizes, the largest of which measures roughly 60 meters by 40 meters, and these voids are not randomly placed but carefully positioned to modulate light, views, circulation, and program, creating what SANAA describes as a kind of Swiss cheese topology where the holes are as important as the solid surfaces. Structurally, this is a long-span concrete shell, which means it relies on its curvature for strength rather than on a dense network of columns or walls, and while there are some slender columns scattered throughout the interior, they're almost imperceptible, reading more like thin reeds in a landscape than structural supports, which reinforces the sense that the slab itself is doing all the work, floating and folding according to some internal logic rather than resting on obvious supports. The engineering challenges were immense because doubly curved concrete surfaces are notoriously difficult to form and pour, requiring custom formwork that can accommodate the constantly changing geometry, and the construction team used a combination of traditional scaffolding and computer-controlled formwork systems to create the molds, pouring the concrete in sections but ensuring continuity across the entire surface so that the structural behavior would be consistent. The result is a slab that performs as a unified structural system, distributing loads through its curves and folds, and this structural continuity is mirrored in the spatial continuity, because there are no expansion joints interrupting the floor, no visible seams breaking the illusion of a single continuous ground plane that happens to rise and fall like a wave frozen in concrete. When you walk through the Rolex Learning Center, the first thing you notice is precisely this sense of ground, of terrain, because unlike most buildings where you're aware of being inside an enclosure defined by walls and ceilings, here you feel as though you're traversing a landscape, and the gentle slopes, which never exceed more than a few degrees, are subtle enough that you barely register them as ramps but steep enough that they create distinct spatial zones without the need for walls or partitions. SANAA has spoken about wanting to create a building where people could find their own place, their own niche, without being directed or controlled by the architecture, and the undulating topography makes this possible because the dips provide natural enclosures for focused individual work. The plateaus become informal gathering spaces, the slopes encourage movement and visual connection, and the voids bring light deep into the interior, while also creating double-height spaces that add drama and orientation to what might otherwise become disorienting in its uniformity. The transparency of the building envelope, which is almost entirely glazed, further blurs the distinction between inside and outside, because from many vantage points within the building you can see through multiple layers of glass to the landscape beyond, and from outside the building appears almost dematerialized, especially at certain times of day when the light equalizes the interior and exterior brightness and the curved glass surfaces reflect the sky and trees, making the building seem to disappear into its surroundings. This transparency is not just visual but also functional, because it allows natural light to penetrate deep into the plan, reducing the need for artificial lighting during the day, and creating a constantly changing atmosphere as the sun moves across the sky, casting shifting patterns of light and shadow across the white surfaces of the interior. Accessibility was a significant consideration in a building organized around continuous slopes rather than discrete floors connected by elevators and stairs, and SANAA addressed this by ensuring that all the slopes remain within accessible gradients, meaning that the entire building is navigable without steps, and there are elevators embedded discreetly into the landscape for those who need them, but the primary circulation system is simply walking, wandering, following the curves, and discovering spaces as you go, which creates a very different experience from the typical library or learning center where you consult a map, find the floor you need, navigate a corridor system, and arrive at your destination. Here, navigation is intuitive and exploratory, more like walking through a park than through an institutional building, and while some critics have argued that this lack of clear wayfinding can be confusing, particularly for first-time visitors looking for a specific resource, others have celebrated it as a liberation from the tyranny of institutional circulation, arguing that the confusion is productive, encouraging serendipitous encounters and unexpected discoveries. The relationship between the Rolex Learning Center and the broader EPFL campus is also worth examining, because the campus itself is a collection of modernist and contemporary buildings scattered across a hillside site overlooking Lake Geneva, and the Rolex Learning Center sits at the heart of this campus, acting as both a physical and symbolic center, a place where students from all disciplines can come together, not just to study but to eat, socialize, relax, and exchange ideas. SANAA designed the building to be porous and welcoming, with multiple entrances at ground level that invite people in from all directions, and because the building is largely glazed and open, you can see through it from almost any approach, which demystifies the interior and encourages casual use rather than intimidating visitors with grand entrances or imposing facades. The landscaping around the building is minimal, mostly grass and paving, which allows the building's form to read clearly, and also creates a kind of continuity between the artificial topography of the building and the natural topography of the site, as if the building were simply a more concentrated, more precise version of the rolling landscape that surrounds it. Inside, the material palette is extremely restrained. White painted concrete for the slab, white terrazzo for the floor where it's not glass, clear glass for the envelope and for some interior partitions, and occasional wood for furniture and built-in elements, and this restraint serves to emphasize the spatial qualities rather than the material ones, making the visitor focus on the curves, the light, the openness, the views, rather than on textures or colors or decorative details. The voids, those 14 oval openings that puncture the slab, are perhaps the most dramatic spatial gestures in the building, because they create moments of verticality within an otherwise relentlessly horizontal composition, and they function in multiple ways. Some are open to the sky, bringing daylight and weather into the interior and creating courtyard-like spaces, while others connect the main level to a lower level that contains additional library stacks and technical spaces, and still, others frame views between different parts of the building or create visual connections between interior and exterior. The edges of these voids are curved and smooth, lined with glass railings that are nearly invisible, and the result is that the voids feel less like cuts or wounds in the surface and more like natural features, like sinkholes or pools, which again reinforces the landscape metaphor. Environmental performance in a building that is essentially a giant glass box with minimal thermal mass and maximum exposure is always going to be challenging, and the Rolex Learning Center has been criticized for its energy consumption, particularly its cooling loads in summer when the greenhouse effect can make parts of the building uncomfortably warm. But SANAA and the engineering team did incorporate several passive and active strategies to mitigate these issues, including the use of the concrete slab itself as thermal mass, a sophisticated shading system integrated into the glass facade, natural ventilation strategies that take advantage of the building's openness, and a geothermal heat pump system that provides heating and cooling. Yet the building's performance remains a topic of debate, with some arguing that the architectural concept was prioritized over environmental responsibility, and others countering that the building's social and pedagogical benefits outweigh its energy costs. The user experience, which is ultimately what the building is designed to serve, is highly subjective and seems to depend largely on individual preferences and needs. Some students and faculty love the openness and flexibility, finding it conducive to collaboration and creative thinking, while others find it too noisy, too exposed, too lacking in the quiet enclosures that concentrated intellectual work sometimes requires, and this tension between openness and enclosure, between collective and individual, is built into the very concept of the building, which refuses to privilege one over the other, but instead tries to accommodate both within a single continuous system. The cafes and restaurants, which are integrated into the undulating landscape rather than being separated into distinct rooms, contribute to the building's social atmosphere, but also mean that the smell of coffee and the sound of conversation permeate spaces that might, in a more traditional library, be reserved for silent study. And whether you see this as a positive blurring of boundaries or as a failure to provide adequate acoustic separation depends on your pedagogical philosophy and your personal work style. From a historical perspective, the Rolex Learning Center can be seen as part of a broader trend in early 21st century architecture toward the dissolution of typological boundaries, the rejection of functional determinism, and the exploration of continuous flowing spaces that resist categorization, and it shares DNA with other projects from the same period that similarly challenged conventional spatial organization, projects like OMA's Seattle Central Library or Zaha Hadid's Pheno Science Center, though SANAA's approach is characteristically more subtle and less overtly dramatic than either of those examples. The influence of the Rolex Learning Center on subsequent academic architecture has been significant, inspiring numerous university libraries and learning centers that similarly embrace openness, transparency, and informal learning environments, though few have attempted the kind of radical structural and spatial continuity that SANAA achieved here, perhaps because the technical challenges and costs are prohibitive, or perhaps because the functional compromises required by such a radical concept give many institutions pause. Critical reception of the building has been mixed but largely positive, with architectural critics praising the boldness of the concept, the precision of the execution, and the experiential richness of the spaces, while also noting the functional challenges and environmental concerns. And the building has won numerous awards, including the 2010 Nikken Sekai Prize and widespread recognition as one of the most important educational buildings of its generation. It's worth noting that SANAA's approach here is fundamentally optimistic about human behavior, trusting that people will use the spaces responsibly and creatively, that they'll find their own ways of working and collaborating within this open framework, and that the lack of prescribed functions and hierarchies will lead to more democratic and innovative uses of space. And whether this optimism is justified depends on who you ask and when you ask them, because the building's success is contingent on its users' willingness to embrace its unconventional logic. Looking at the Rolex Learning Center 15 years after its completion, what becomes clear is that it's not just a building but a provocation, a carefully constructed argument about what learning spaces could be if we were willing to abandon our inherited assumptions about how they should be organized. And whether you agree with that argument or not, whether you find the building inspiring or frustrating, liberating or confusing, there's something valuable in the mere fact that it exists, that someone built it, that students and faculty use it every day, because it demonstrates that alternatives to conventional institutional architecture are not just theoretically possible but physically realizable. And in doing so, it expands the realm of what we can imagine and what we can demand from the buildings that shape our daily lives. The Rolex Learning Center challenges us to think about space not as a container to be divided and labeled, but as a medium to be sculpted and inhabited, about structure not as a separate system to be hidden or celebrated, but as an integral part of spatial experience, and about program not as a set of discrete requirements to be efficiently accommodated, but as a fluid set of activities that can overlap and interact in productive ways. And these challenges remain relevant today as we continue to grapple with questions about how our buildings can foster collaboration while respecting individual needs, how they can be environmentally responsible while still providing the spatial qualities that make them worth inhabiting, and how they can be both functionally pragmatic and spatially ambitious. If you found this exploration of SANAA's Rolex Learning Center valuable, and you'd like to see more deep dives into contemporary architecture that challenges conventions and expands possibilities, consider subscribing to UrbArchitect and sharing your thoughts in the comments below about what buildings or ideas you'd like us to examine next, because this ongoing conversation about architecture, about how we shape space and how space shapes us, is something we're building together, one video at a time.